Every empire is convinced that it has discovered a revolutionary kind of money. Every empire believes that its system is different, more modern, more controlled, more advanced, and that the old rules don't apply anymore. And without exception, every empire is eventually forced to face the same unpleasant reality. It was wrong, because money keeps operating under a fixed set of laws. These aren't polite guidelines. They don't care about national pride, campaign promises, expert forecasts, or optimistic speeches about stability. They reflect raw behavior and power, and they reappear again and again across centuries. These laws are not openly taught. You won't see them printed in legal charters. They get pieced together by people living through breakdowns and then conveniently erased once things calm down, until the next crisis forces people to rediscover them all over again. If you go through life without understanding these laws, the financial system will always feel like a hostile machine that quietly drains you while telling you it's doing you a favor. That's not an accident. That is part of how the system protects itself. What we're going to do now is walk through the core laws of money that keep repeating whether you're looking at the Roman denarius or modern central bank policy announcements. You'll see how shaving silver off coins, printing bills by the ton, and injecting digital liquidity into markets are all versions of the same script. And you'll see why the structure of that script was never built for fairness. We begin with the most unforgiving principle of all, Gresham's Law. In the 16th century, Sir Thomas Gresham explained a rule to Queen Elizabeth Triffin in plain terms. Bad money drives out good. It wasn't a metaphor. It was an observation about what ordinary people actually do when they're forced to handle two different forms of money at the same time. The rule works like this. Imagine a situation where two kinds of currency are circulating in parallel. One is sound, trusted, contains real value. The other has been weakened, diluted, corrupted, cheapened by whoever controls the mint. What happens next is consistent almost every time. People spend the damaged money and stash the solid money. They push the debased currency outward into the marketplace and hide away the higher quality version for themselves. You can watch this process unfold in ancient Rome. The Roman denarius originally carried meaningful silver content. Over time, as the empire's financial pressures mounted, that silver content was quietly reduced and replaced with more base metals. On paper, the coin still counted as a denarius. In practice, citizens could see what was happening. They weren't naive. They weren't going to act like a lower silver coin was equivalent to one struck back when the metal content was stronger. So, what did they do? They used the newly watered-down coins to settle taxes, pay obligations, and clear debts. Meanwhile, the older, purer silver coins gradually disappeared from daily trade. Those better coins flowed into hiding, hoarded, saved, protected. The same dynamic surfaced throughout medieval Europe whenever rulers clipped coins, filed edges, or quietly replaced gold content with cheaper copper or other base metals. The public reacted instantly, without needing to read a theory book. They understood at an instinctive level that the ruler was weakening the currency, so they adjusted their own behavior to protect themselves. And that survival behavior has a cascading effect. Once people start dumping the worst money into circulation and locking the better money away out of sight, the average quality of money in daily use sinks. Trust erodes. Prices become unstable. Deals and wages lose clarity because nobody believes the unit of account is consistent anymore. Confidence in the money starts fraying. That erosion of belief is the first phase of monetary breakdown. That is Gresham's Law in action. When those in charge of money try to cheat by degrading it, the population responds in a predictable way that ends up hollowing out trust in the currency itself. But there is a second law that emerges when things get bad enough. If Gresham's Law describes the slow poisoning of money as it's diluted step by step, then the next rule describes what happens when the system actually snaps. That rule is known as Thiers Law, named after Adolphe Thiers, a 19th century French politician who studied financial collapse. Thiers' insight is that in the middle of outright crisis, the pattern flips. Instead of bad money drives out good, reality becomes good money drives out bad. At first glance, that sounds like the opposite of Gresham, but it's not a contradiction. It's the next stage. Consider Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Prices weren't just climbing, they were detonating. The value of the German mark was melting away between paychecks. between sunrise and sunset. People were hauling stacks of banknotes in carts just to try to buy bread. In that kind of environment, no sane person wanted to hold that collapsing currency for even a day longer than necessary. The smart move was to get rid of it immediately and convert it into anything sturdier. So, people dumped marks and ran to alternatives, foreign currencies like US dollars, physical gold, cigarettes, or direct barter for goods that still held practical value. You can see similar behavior in later hyperinflations, such as Zimbabwe and Venezuela. When the last thread of trust snaps, citizens don't just hoard good money and spend bad money. They abandon the bad money altogether. They stop believing in the state's promise behind the currency. Even if the law still insists that it's legal tender, they flee into whatever else still works as a store of value or medium of exchange. That breaking point, where the official currency is treated like a hot coal you can't hold for more than a second, is the domain of Thiers Law. Gresham's law covers the drawn-out decay stage, where leaders quietly water down the currency and people quietly adapt. Thiers Law covers the sudden death stage, where the pretense ends and the public exits en masse into harder alternatives. So, that gives us two ends of the spectrum: gradual debasement on one side, total rejection on the other. But most people today are living in the middle, not at either extreme. In the middle, salaries are still denominated in the national currency. Groceries can still be bought in that currency. The system is still standing, but something about it feels tilted and predatory. That middle zone is where the Cantillon Effect becomes visible. The Cantillon Effect is a rule described in the early 18th century by Richard Cantillon, an economist with a sharp eye for how money actually moves. He noticed something fundamental. When new money is created, it doesn't enter society in a fair, neutral way. It enters through specific gates. It shows up first in the hands of certain players, governments, financial institutions, well-connected insiders, and only later does it filter down to everyone else. That order matters. The groups closest to the source of new money get to spend it before prices have fully adjusted. They buy assets, land, resources, services, and investments, while those things are still priced at yesterday's levels. By the time that newly created money slowly reaches wage earners and savers, prices have already been pushed upward. So, ordinary households don't get the benefit. They get the bill. This pattern is not theoretical. After the financial crisis of 2008, central banks flooded markets with liquidity to rescue the system. The first place that money pooled was in financial assets. Stock markets recovered quickly and then surged. Major institutions healed. Meanwhile, median wages for regular workers lagged behind. The headline narrative talked about recovery and stabilization. But for millions of people, it didn't feel like recovery. It felt like treading water or sinking. The pattern repeated during the wave of stimulus and intervention from 2020 to 2021. New money was pushed into the system. Yes, people received direct payments, but that flood of liquidity, combined with supply strain and policy choices, translated into sharp price jumps in daily life. Groceries cost more. Housing costs spiked. Essential living expenses accelerated. By the time many people actually touch that new money, inflation had already chewed away its real buying power. The Cantillon Effect is the hidden mechanism behind that experience. It shows how inflation functions as a form of wealth redistribution. It's not just that prices went up. It's that value was transferred quietly, from the people who got money last to the people who got money first. The process favors those plugged into the source of issuance and punishes those on the outside who are told to be patient, to save, to behave. The brutality of the Cantillon Effect is that it's systemic. It doesn't require illegal activity. It's baked into policy itself. People who work, save, and follow the rules feel poorer in purchasing power terms. But they can't point to one visible moment where it was taken. The drain is invisible, and the crucial implication is this: those at the top of the structure don't just wind up richer because they outperformed in some fair contest. They literally receive new money under more favorable timing before inflation spreads through the system and devalues that money for everyone else. If the Cantillon Effect explains why newly created money moves upward first, then the concept known as financial repression explains how governments make sure that ordinary people remain stuck even after they realize what's happening. The phrase financial repression emerged in the period following World War II. After the war, many nations were buried under enormous debt burdens. Leaders faced an ugly menu of choices. They could raise taxes dramatically and risk angering the public. They could default and destroy their credibility and access to future borrowing. Or they could find a quieter method, one that wouldn't look, on the surface, like outright confiscation, but would still gradually erase the debt. They chose the quiet method. Here's how that method works. Central banks hold interest rates down, very low, deliberately, and for long stretches. Often those controlled interest rates sit below the real rate of inflation. That single detail matters. It means that if you are a normal saver keeping money in the bank, your safe savings are mathematically guaranteed to lose purchasing power year after year. On paper, your account balance might barely move or rise a little. In reality, what that money can buy declines. It's a slow bleed. At the same time, governments apply controls and restrictions that make it hard for regular citizens to shift their capital elsewhere. Moving money across borders, buying alternative assets freely, or stepping outside the approved domestic saving channels becomes difficult, restricted, or discouraged. The result is a trap. Citizens are kept inside a controlled financial environment where their stored savings quietly erode, and they aren't given easy exits. Meanwhile, that erosion of private savings benefits the state. As inflation eats away at the real value of outstanding public debt, the government's obligations shrink in real terms. Instead of openly imposing a heavy new tax to pay off what it owes, the system dissolves that debt by letting inflation and suppressed interest rates do the work. In other words, the cost is shifted onto savers without telling them. That structure did not disappear in the 20th century. It re-emerged in modern form. After the 2008 financial crisis, interest rates collapsed towards zero and then stayed pinned for an extended period. Anyone who tried to do the responsible thing, park money in savings, avoid speculation, saw their purchasing power decay in slow motion. Meanwhile, those who already owned assets like stocks and real estate watched those assets inflate in value. Then, from 2020 through 2021, rates plunged again. Vast amounts of liquidity hit the system, and prices for essentials, food, shelter, jumped hard. The end result was familiar. Everyday savers fell behind, often without fully understanding why. That's financial repression in a modern suit. And from the standpoint of a heavily indebted government, its appeal is obvious. Most people don't realize they're being harvested. They only know that life feels tighter, that their savings don't stretch, that they're doing what they were told to do, and still losing ground. Up to this point, we've been dealing with how these laws affect individuals, households, and domestic economies. But some laws operate at empire scale. One of the most important is called Triffin's paradox, also described as the reserve currency dilemma. In the 1960s, economist Robert Triffin went before the U.S. Congress and pointed out a structural flaw built into the Bretton Woods order. His warning was direct. If the U.S. dollar was going to function as the world's reserve currency, then the United States had to supply dollars to the rest of the world. International trade, cross-border finance, settlement of global accounts, all of that required a steady flow of dollars circulating outside America. But that flow had a cost. To send dollars abroad, the United States needed to run trade deficits, to buy more from other countries than it sold back, effectively shipping dollars overseas in exchange for foreign goods. In the short run, this framework seemed brilliant. The dollar was widely trusted. Global trade expanded under that shared confidence. The system looked stable because everyone believed in the dollar's promise. Over the long run, though, Triffin argued that this same mechanism would create growing instability. The more dollars the U.S. pumped out into the world, the looser the dollar's link to gold would become. Confidence in the idea that dollars could always be redeemed for gold at a set rate would weaken. Other nations would start to doubt that the U.S. could actually honor the gold convertibility that underpinned the system. That tension finally surfaced in 1971 when President Richard Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. From that moment forward, the dollar was no longer anchored to a gold standard. It became purely fiat, money backed by decree and enforced by the weight of U.S. power and trust in U.S. creditworthiness. Since then, the pattern Triffin described has kept playing out. The U.S. has run chronic trade deficits, continuously exporting dollars and importing physical goods built elsewhere. Domestically, That arrangement has carried a price. Manufacturing capacity drained out. Debt loads swelled. The financial sector, on the other hand, remained influential and central because the world still needed dollar-denominated assets and dollar liquidity. Triffin's paradox shows why this is not an accident. To sit on the throne as issuer of the reserve currency, the U.S. must accept internal strain. It must tolerate persistent imbalances. It must live with a structure where it consumes more than it produces in order to keep the rest of the world supplied with dollars. That helps maintain financial dominance and geopolitical leverage, but it also undermines parts of the domestic base that once generated real production. And now, the stress lines are visible. Other powers, such as China and Russia, along with coalitions like the BRICS bloc, are experimenting with alternate arrangements. Central banks in multiple countries have been accumulating gold at a pace not seen in roughly half a century. The message behind those moves is not subtle. Blind dependence on a single reserve currency is being questioned. In other words, the global system that handed the United States enormous influence also embedded the seeds of its own long-term weakening. That's the heart of Triffin's paradox. Reserve currency status is both an unmatched advantage and a built-in liability. If Triffin's paradox exposes how the international monetary structure paints itself into a corner, then Goodhart's law explains why attempts by governments and central banks to manage that structure often backfire and distort reality. In the 1970s, economist Charles Goodhart made a blunt observation. When a measurement becomes a policy target, it stops functioning as an honest measurement. Modern governments and central banks are obsessed with certain numbers. They talk about inflation staying around 2%. They talk about unemployment staying within an acceptable range. They talk about gross domestic product growth hitting a politically comfortable pace. These figures are supposed to describe what's happening in the real economy. But the moment leaders decide that specific numbers must be hit, must at any cost, those numbers lose their meaning as neutral signals. Instead of using the metric to understand reality, policymakers start bending reality to produce the metric. Take inflation targeting. For decades, central banks promised to hold inflation at roughly 2%. That figure turned into a sacred benchmark. To defend it, they cut interest rates, injected liquidity, and intervened in markets over and over. On paper, the official inflation readings stayed moderate and controlled. The headline narrative said price stability, but daily life told a different story. The core pillars of normal existence, shelter, medical care, education, climbed in cost far faster than those clean official numbers suggested. At the same time, asset bubbles swelled and debt levels climbed because cheap money kept pouring into markets. The system could proudly announce success in hitting the target, even while the very process was quietly producing instability and pain. Or look at GDP. Politicians present GDP growth as proof of health. But once keeping GDP elevated became the priority itself, governments leaned into policies that would juice that figure in the short term. Piling on debt, outsourcing actual production, inflating speculative cycles. As long as the growth number printed well, the story was prosperity, even when the underlying structure was getting increasingly fragile. Goodhart's law exposes the trap underneath this behavior. Once you stop letting metrics describe reality and start forcing reality to match the metrics, you lose the ability to see the truth. The measures get gamed and polished. The underlying system gets more brittle, but the official dashboard still says everything is fine. That brings us to the final rule in this chain. The law of diminishing returns on debt. This one isn't wrapped in ancient language. It's not tied to a single historical advisor whispering in a monarch's ear. It's just the hard arithmetic that defines the current era. Debt, at the beginning, looks productive. Borrowing can finance expansion. It can build infrastructure, fund growth, create momentum. In the early stages, $1 of new debt might generate $1 or more of actual economic activity. Debt feels like an engine. But as total debt builds and builds, that engine loses efficiency. The payoff per new dollar of borrowing falls. You borrow $1 and get maybe 50 cents of genuine output. Then, maybe 25 cents. Then, even less. Eventually, you arrive at a stage where debt is still stacking higher, but the real economy is barely moving. Growth stalls in practical terms even while the borrowing machine keeps humming. At that point, Debt is no longer being used to drive forward motion. It's being used to prevent collapse. The system isn't accelerating anymore. It's just straining to hold itself together under the weight. That is where we are now. The United States is carrying federal debt that exceeds $30 trillion. Each new burst of borrowing is generating less broad, durable prosperity and more financial patchwork. The new debt props up markets, maintains entitlements, and sustains appearances. It keeps institutions and obligations afloat, but it is not producing equivalent real wealth for society as a whole. The numbers won't lie here. Debt saturation is where every dominant power eventually arrives. When Rome's expansion slowed, it debased its currency. In France before 1789, the monarchy relied on borrowing until the system snapped and the political order unraveled. The British Empire emerged from 2 world wars carrying immense debt that strained its ability to maintain global reach. And now the United States is confronting the same pattern, using debt to buy time, to defer consequences, to extend the runway, but not to solve the underlying problem. The conclusion of this law is harsh. Debt can delay the reckoning, debt can push the crisis into the future, debt can keep the machine from seizing up today. But debt cannot make the bill disappear. Now, pull all of these laws together, and you see the shape of the system. Money is not a neutral tool designed to treat everyone fairly. It follows rules that behave almost like gravity. One rule shows that once a currency is weakened, people instinctively shove the weaker version into circulation and hide the stronger version, and that pattern eats away at trust. Another shows that when collapse hits full force, the social contract around money disintegrates and people bolt into anything that still holds value, abandoning the official currency in everything but name. Another shows that when new money is created, it's routed first to those closest to power, who get to spend it at yesterday's prices, while everyone else receives it later after prices have already climbed. Another shows that when governments owe more than they can comfortably repay, they can quietly pin down interest rates, wall off capital, and let inflation hollow out private savings so that public debt shrinks in real terms without a public declaration of default. Another shows that when a country's currency becomes the backbone of global trade, that country gains leverage and reach, but only by accepting internal damage, exporting paper claims while importing physical goods, and bleeding out parts of its own productive base. Another shows that when political and financial authorities start obsessing over hitting specific numerical targets, those targets stop reflecting reality and instead start warping it, leaving the system fragile under a polished surface. And another shows that debt, which begins as a growth engine, eventually flips into dead weight. Borrowing stops being a tool of expansion and becomes a life support system that barely keeps the structure standing. These are not disconnected curiosities. They're the operating logic of monetary history. They explain why prices at the supermarket rise faster than paychecks. They explain why wages don't seem to keep up, even during so-called recoveries. They explain why mortgages feel heavier while financial markets post record highs. They explain how nations can ride waves of credit, trust, and reserve currency privilege for decades, and then face a reckoning when confidence thins. None of this is random noise. It is the recurring cycle. There is one last point that almost nobody tells plainly. The system was not engineered to prioritize the security of ordinary participants. It was designed to preserve itself. People in the general public live under constant visibility and obligation. You report income. You get audited. You submit paperwork. You pay what you owe on time because you're compelled to. But those near the core of monetary power operate with a different set of conditions. They benefit from earlier access to liquidity. They can move assets across borders. They position themselves in holdings that get inflated upward by the same policies that quietly corrode everyone else's savings. You're told to hold cash that loses purchasing power year after year. They hold assets that tend to appreciate precisely because of that erosion. You carry the rules. They live with exceptions. The machine follows its own internal laws, and unless you learn those laws, you're effectively navigating blind through a game that was set up long before you entered it. History doesn't repeat in a perfect loop, event for event, but money keeps obeying the same core laws across time. If you don't understand those laws, they will keep grinding you down. If this changed how you see the system, hit subscribe. The answers are in history, and I'll show you where to look.